Now obviously, as we mentioned last week, the bank issue is going to be the big issue in this election of 1832. Obviously, the Republicans and whoever they nominate for their candidate is going to be for the Bank of the United States, and Jackson is going to be renominated by the Democratic Party. He's certainly going to campaign against it. Okay? Now, guess who the Republicans nominate for president? Ironically, Henry Clay. Yeah. So the Republicans nominate Henry Clay for the presidency. The Republicans, yeah. Remember Jackson, that's a good point, Kendrick, because remember Jackson split up from Republicans and started the Democratic Republicans. So now we have the Democrats and Republicans. So, Henry Clay is going to run for the presidency on the Republican ticket, and a fellow by the name of John Sargent is going to be his vice presidential running mate. Okay? So it'll be Henry Clay for president and John Sargent for vice president. And of course, Clay is going to campaign, in favor of the Bank of the United States, keeping it. Well, Jackson is going to be nominated for re-election by the Democratic Party, and the man that's going to run as his vice presidential candidate is going to be Martin Van Buren of New York. So on the Republican side, you're going to have Henry Clay for president and John Sargent for vice president. On the Democratic side, you're going to have President Jackson running for re-election. His running mate will be Martin Van Buren of New York for the vice presidency. Clay is going to campaign in favor of the Bank of the United States. Jackson is going to continue his vigorous opposition to the Bank of the United States. Now, despite the bitter feelings the two parties had concerning the Bank of the United States, Jackson will win re-election. And he will win re-election by a surprisingly large margin. Again, the common people have come out in his support. So despite the bitter feelings between the two parties concerning the Bank of the United States, President Jackson will win re-election. He will get 219 electoral votes to just 49 for Henry Clay. So the president will win the election with 219 electoral votes. Henry Clay will get only 49. That was a big surprise. People thought this would be a much closer election, and historians, believed at the start that Clay had a good chance to win, but he got crushed. This was a horrible crushing defeat for the Republicans. They won't even be a factor in the next election of 1836. They won't even be involved. Okay? They'll be involved, but they'll be terribly involved. Okay? So, this is a crushing defeat for the Republican Party. They're not even going to be a factor in the election of 1836. Well, that'll take us to our next subtopic, which is destroying the Bank of the United States. Yep.
Who became the vice president?
Martin Van Buren.
Oh.
Yeah, Martin Van Buren. That's key, Carter, because he's going to be succeeding Jackson when Jackson's had enough here down the line. So, destroying the Bank of the United States. What do you think Jackson's #1 goal was if he won re-election in 1832? To destroy the Bank of the United States. He was a sneaky son of a gun. Now, do you know what it means when Congress goes into recess? I never take my kids to D.C. when Congress is in recess. Why wouldn't I do that? Why wouldn't I take them to D.C. when Congress is in recess?
Because protesters and stuff?
No, well, they have, some bigger than others, but what does it mean when the Congress is in recess? They take time off to go do what? See their families. They get a little vacation. So I never take kids when Congress is in recess because we can't meet with the senators and Congress people because they're not there, okay? And it's very difficult to get capital tours and that kind of thing when Congress is in recess, when they take some time off. Well, this is what Jackson did. After he was elected president, he waited till Congress went into recess. In other words, he waited till they went on vacation. And when Congress went on recess, Jackson ordered his Secretary of the Treasury to move all federal funds from the Bank of the United States into state banks, selected state banks. So while Congress was in recess, President Jackson ordered his Secretary of the Treasury to move all federal funds that were in the Bank of the United States out and put them into separate little state banks. Now those state banks would be referred to in history as pet banks because they're all loyal to the president's pet, right? You've heard of the teacher's pet? All these banks were pet banks because they were all loyal to President Jackson. So again, while Congress goes into recess, President Jackson tells his Secretary of State to move all federal funds that are presently in the Bank of the United States, which would be a lot of money, and move those funds into state banks, which are referred to as pet banks, because they're all loyal to President Jackson. Now, if you're the Secretary of the Treasury, what would you think about that?
Probably didn't want to do it.
No, didn't want to do it because he knew it wasn't right, so he refused to do it. So what did Jackson do? Fired him. So the Secretary of the Treasury refused to move the funding, and Jackson fired him and appointed a new Secretary of the Treasury. What did he tell that new Secretary of the Treasury? Same exact thing. I want you to move all the federal funds from the Bank of the United States into these state banks. And what did the second Secretary of the Treasury think about that? He didn't like it either, and he refused, so what did Jackson do? Fired him and appointed another one. And finally, the third man complied with the president, and he moved the federal funds out of the Bank of the United States into these state banks or pet banks. So Jackson orders his first Secretary of the Treasury to move the funds. He refuses, he fires him. He appoints a new Secretary of the Treasury who in turn refuses to move the funds, and he fires him. And he finally appoints a third man that complies with his request, and the federal funds are moved into state banks. Yes?
So how long does Congress go on recess?
Oh, weekish.
You got 3 people in under.
Oh, yeah.
Only 3 people in under 3 days.
Yeah, he gets it done. He got her done.
When he was hiring the second guy, when he asked him like,
Well,
hey, I'm hiring you to do this, are you willing to do that?
Yeah, but see, do you think he cared? I mean, Jackson's personality is he assumed when he hired the second guy to do what he's told. Well, he didn't. That's just how he was. But anyway, so what do you think happens when the Republican-controlled Congress goes back into session? They're not happy. Yeah, they're very mad. They're actually, when they realized what Jackson had done, they were quite furious. So they voted to censure Andrew Jackson. It's on your ID sheet. They voted to censure him. Does anybody know what that means if you're censured? I don't think I've censured. I censured Alec early in the year when Alec hadn't figured out that he had to turn in all of his assignments. And we didn't take that for, what I censured you, what did I do? Well, yeah, I did. But what's the proper name? So I only yelled at you, so I didn't make you stay after school. I warned you, but what do you call it when somebody tells you not to do that again or I'll take action? They reprimand. So I reprimanded him in a yelling way. I kind of threatened you, I guess. I can't remember what I told you, but anyway. Anyway, Congress censured the president. That means they reprimanded him. Now, I reprimanded Alec, although he has a different version, for conduct unbecoming of an AP U.S. history student. They censured Jackson for conduct unbecoming of a President of the United States. So Congress, after finding out about Jackson's actions during their recess, were very angry, and the Republican-controlled Congress voted to censure or reprimand Andrew Jackson for conduct unbecoming of a President of the United States. Now, I will tell you that Alec Pecoria, he adjusted to my reprimand and accepted it very gracefully and has done very well since, much better than President Jackson accepted this one, okay? Now, when you're censured, you can be censured if there's conduct unbecoming of a member of the Congress, they can censure you. It's a reprimand. That's a bad thing. That's really, if you get censured, that's really a black mark against you. Stays with you forever, okay? Not good. Well, Jackson didn't care he got censured, because what else happened in that election of 1832?
He was reelected.
He was reelected, but how about the Congress
Oh,
that took over?
Democrats.
They became Democratic controlled, and they basically rescinded his censure. Rescinded it. In essence, as far as history is concerned, it never happened. It did, but it didn't. It's not on his record, okay? So, he didn't care that the Republican-controlled Congress censured him, because he knew that the Democrats would all be sworn in pretty soon, and it'd be a Democratic-controlled Congress, and when that happened, they rescinded the censure, which basically resulted in saying it never happened. Well, what happened to the Bank of the United States after all the funding was pulled out?
Bankrupt.
It did poorly, and that charter that Jackson vetoed before the summer of '32 was not renewed in '36, and the bank was forced to close. So eventually, after the 4-year lease of the Bank of the United States ended, it did not get renewed by the Democratic-controlled Congress, and as a result of that, in 1836, it forced to close. So Jackson destroyed the Bank of the United States. Oh, this is a great story. An assassination attempt. An assassination attempt.
So by Henry Clay.
No. Even liked to him, I'm sure. Do you know Andrew Jackson had an assassination attempt?
It's hilarious.
It is pretty good. Dash is going to help you with it. So at this point, on January 30th of 1835, Jackson is 67 years old. Tough old bird, still running the country, 67 years old, on January 30th of 1835. And he's visiting the Capitol building on that date. So, on January 30th, 1835, President Jackson's now 67 years old, and he's visiting the Capitol building. Security was a lot different in those days, kiddos, right? A lot different. And an insane, unemployed house painter by the name of Richard Lawrence approached President Jackson on January 30th of 1835 while President Jackson was visiting the Capitol building. An insane, unemployed house painter by the name of Richard Lawrence approached the president. When he got close enough to the president, he pulled out a pistol, pointed it at the president, and fired. So on January 30th of 1835, while President Jackson was visiting the Capitol building, an insane, unemployed house painter by the name of Richard Lawrence approached the president, pointed his pistol at the president, and fired. What happened, Dash?
It didn't work.
Yeah, the pistol misfired. So what did Richard Lawrence do?
Pulled out a second pistol.
Pulled out a second pistol and fired it at the president, which
Also misfired.
also misfired. Can you imagine that? So he pulls out the first pistol, points it at Jackson, point blank range, misfires. Lawrence pulls out a second pistol, points it at Jackson, point blank range, it also misfires. You would think that Jackson would turn tail and run after not one, but two misfires. But no, what does he do, Dash?
He promptly proceeds to beat the crap out of him.
With his
Cane.
Yeah. Jackson is so angry, he grabs his cane and begins to beat the hell out of the guy that tried to shoot him. He was at him so hard that his aides had to restrain him from beating the guy. So President Jackson was so angry with the assassination attempt, he went after Lawrence with his cane and beat the hell out of him. That is right. I'm getting to be at 7 years, I'll be there. So, at the age of 67, Andrew Jackson had to be restrained by members of his staff, surviving to live another day. Quite a character, this Andrew Jackson. All right, that's going to take us to a very interesting election, which is the election of 1836, and this will be on your test for sure. So make sure you key in and understand what's going on here. It's an interesting election. Well, the big question prior to the election of 1836 for the Democrats is whether what?
Jackson's gonna run it.
Jackson's going to run again. Many Americans believed and would have supported Jackson. He could have been president for life if he wanted to. Probably no question about it at this time in history. He could have run multiple times. So prior to the election of 1836, the big question was whether Jackson would run for another term as president. Well, he decided to retire, announcing that he would not run for a third term. So the big question surrounding the early part of the election of 1836 is whether President Jackson was going to run for re-election. Many people in this country believed that I think would have happened. He could have been president for as long as he lived if he wanted to, but he chose to retire, opening the door for who to get the Democratic nomination? Vice President Martin Van Buren. Okay? So after his decision, the Democratic Party nominated Vice President Martin Van Buren for the presidency. The man that would run with Martin Van Buren for the vice presidency of the Democratic Party would be Richard M. Johnson. Richard M. Johnson would run with Van Buren. So for the Democratic Party in 1836, it will be Vice President Martin Van Buren for president, Richard M. Johnson for vice president. What about the Republican Party? Who'd they nominate, Wyatt? No.
Clay?
No.
Knew it.
They weren't involved. They were in disarray after their butt kicking in 1832. So a new party formed called the Whig Party. And who did they nominate, Wyatt? William Henry and
Hugh White.
and Daniel Webster. They nominated 3 different candidates for the presidency. William Henry Harrison, Hugh L. White, and old Daniel Webster, the man that in the old days representing the northeastern part of the United States. They did this on purpose. This was their strategy. The Whig Party purposely did not choose one presidential candidate, but chose 3 separate candidates for the presidency. William Henry Harrison, Hugh L. White, and Daniel Webster. The selection of 3 candidates was a strategy used by the Whig Party that went down in history known as the favorite son policy. So the purposeful nomination of 3 candidates by the Whig Party was a strategy historians refer to as the favorite son policy. Now, let me think, you guys have been around here long to know, if you split a party, does that increase or decrease your chances of winning? Normally decreases, big time. So what has got to be the thought process of the Whigs in this election? Why in the world would they do that, Connor?
Trying to take away votes from the Democratic Party.
That trying to take away votes from Martin Van Buren. Now, what's their goal, though? When the election, when the dust clears, when everybody votes and the electoral votes are counted, what's their goal? Just the opposite.
They'll be
That
taken
none
out.
of the four would get enough electoral votes to be
So they
elected.
get taken to the House.
Because they want it to go to the House, because they believe they cannot defeat the Democrats one-on-one. They think the only way they can win is if they have enough candidates run to split the vote, whereas it goes to the House of Representatives. Because we know if you do not receive 2/3 majority of the electoral vote cast, you cannot win. Jackson had that happen to him in 1824, right? Well, that was the strategy, okay? By choosing 3 candidates, the Whig Party hoped to divide the number of electoral votes so that no candidate received the 2/3 majority for election. Obviously, if no candidate received the majority of electoral votes, the election would be sent to the House of Representatives, and the Whig Party believed that they had enough influence in the House that one of their 3 candidates would be elected president. Admirable strategy. Unfortunately, didn't work. When the smoke cleared, Martin Van Buren won the election with 170 electoral votes. Martin Van Buren wins the election of 1836 with 170 electoral votes.